You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest of the program today, and I want to welcome Kyle Shideler. He's the Director of the Threat Information Office at the Center for Security Policy. And Kyle, first of all, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
First of all, you're here to answer a lot of things that John and I have been questioning and wondering for, probably years now. But certainly as we've seen the conflict, the war between the Israelis and I call them the terrorists that occupy Gaza. But we've seen almost a concerted, orchestrated, cohesive effort around the world to speak out and protest against, I call it Israel. There's been a lot of anti-Semitism, but there's been a drastic increase also. And you guys have a report here that you've been working on, and you've been following some information. So I'd love for you to give us the details of the process that you're using and what you're looking at. But the involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood in the worldwide rise of these anti-Semitic protests with regards to what's happening in Gaza.
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on. I really appreciate it. We think this is an important topic because as hostilities between Israel and Hamas kicked off, we began to see a number of protests, including very violent protests, almost riots would be a better term, particularly in France. And a lot of the reporting was covering the sort of anti-Semitic nature of these protests, but what they were doing was they were painting a picture of almost a sort of 1938 classic European anti-Semitism angle to it. And the reality that we found was that it had a much more Islamist and Islamic character to these protests than most media was really covering. And we were kind of wondering, okay, well, how did this come about? So we started to look at a certain known bad actor, a man named Youssef al-Qaradawi. Youssef al-Qaradawi is the leader of something called the International Union of Muslim Scholars. He's also a very long-time leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. To put it in perspective how important he is in the Muslim Brotherhood, it should be understood that he studied directly underneath founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. So he goes back a long, long time. He was asked twice to take up the position of Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a position he turned down because he was doing sort of other things. But he's a man that leads a group called the Union of the Good, which is a group of Islamic charities which are involved in funding Hamas. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Holy Land Foundation, which was an Islamic charity which was shut down by the Justice Department for funding for Hamas. And, of course, HLF is one branch, was the American branch of the Union of the Good. So Qaradawi is a man very, very close to the Muslim Brotherhood and very, very senior in its leadership. So we took a look at the International Union of Muslim Scholars website to see what they were saying about the situation in Gaza and in the conflict with Israel. And what we found was that they were issuing a series of increasingly dramatic calls for uprisings, literally uprisings, intifadas, for those of you familiar with the term intifada. And this is the language that they were using, and they were very specific in calling for intifadas in both the Arab world and in the Western world, in the free world as well. And so we decided that it would be important to look and see to what extent were these calls being answered. Were the protests that we were seeing tied to the calls that Qaradawi was issuing? In terms of timing, in terms of character. And what we found was this seems to be the case. So, for instance, the International Union of Muslim Scholars issued statements calling for uprisings on July 4th, July 17th, July 7th, July 9th, July 16th, July 18th. Then Qaradawi went on Al Jazeera and issued another call on both the 20th and 21st, as well as the 27th. And when IUMS made these calls, what we saw was usually a slight delay, followed by the actual carrying out of protests around the world, typically organized or at least participated with members of groups that we know to be Muslim Brotherhood organizations. So, and then we thought that was a pretty interesting correlation, and so we put together this report in order to provide some people some information about it.
Well, it's kind of like Barack Obama talking about how unfair it is in America, and all of a sudden you have an Occupy movement, and all of our cities, start having 10 cities pop up in the middle of the streets. But here's the problem, and I think you've outlined this pretty good in your analysis there. And the fact is that we know who some of the prior funders or actual terrorist organizations are. However, they simply, it's almost like if the KKK tomorrow says, hey, we're renaming ourselves, we're going to be the JJJ, and then next month we'll become the LLL, and then we'll follow that with the MMM, so because, no one will pick up on the fact that, we're just a different organization. And I think that's what we see here. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think a lot of people don't really recognize this, but they go back a very long time. And, in fact, they actually go pre-World War II, pre-Adolf Hitler, and they have worked with a lot of these fascist-type people before. In fact, they worked directly with the Nazis during World War II. And this is nothing but a continuation, which is why we're seeing and calling it for what it is, and that is anti-Semitism. But I think here's a question I have, and I think it's very problematic. It might not have to do with what your report is necessarily, but it seems to me that more so than ever, the American administration, the Obama administration, and others have been willing to sit down and have dialogue with Hamas and even some of the other organizations, which are named terrorist organizations. And we see the same thing in Iran. And so I ask myself, and then you draw the connection of what happened in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a significant shift in the policy. And the question I have for you, I'm sorry for all that information in one breath, but the question I have is this increase in an anti-Semitism happening because of the actions of not just the American administration, but, say, the French, the British, and some of the other nations?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the anti-Semitism is a direct result of the policies of various Western administrations. What I would say, I think, is that there was a very conscious effort to engage with Islamist organizations, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, both here in the United States and in Europe, even prior to the current administration, even under the George W. Bush administration and the Clinton administration, there was engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood. U.S. connection with the Muslim Brotherhood actually goes back as far as the 1950s. There's an excellent book on this by a man named Ian Johnson called The Mosque in Munich. So we have had ties and connections with Islamist organizations going back as long as there have been Islamist organizations operating in the West. But I think part of the vehemence that we see is in part a turn by the Brotherhood towards a more confrontational stance. They've spent a very long time, obviously, siding up to the West, and I think they feel like they have ridden that train as far as it will take them, and they are starting to move towards a more confrontational position, and so we're starting to see some of their true colors in a way that we maybe didn't see before. But, I mean, to characterize these protests as anti-Semitic is absolutely correct. I mean, we looked at a lot of open source video of various protests, and we saw chants, for instance, of Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad will return. Khaybar is referring to an incident in Islamic history where the saying goes that the army of Muhammad slaughtered some 700 Jews in the town of Khaybar, in the Arabian town of Khaybar. So this is a direct, almost genocidal threat. We also saw calls such as the martyr is the beloved of Allah, referring to one who gives their life in jihad. There is no God but Allah, and Israel is the enemy of Allah. There was also, and it was interesting because it took place in Dallas. There's a lot of talk about the European anti-Semitism, but these calls, these Islamist chants, we saw them in the U.S. just as much as we saw them in Europe. Maybe the size and intensity was a little less, but still in America we saw all of these chants. We even saw in Dallas the chant Udrab, Udrab Tel Aviv, which means bomb Tel Aviv. And it's also the refrain of a very popular Hamas nasheed. And in all these protests as well, we saw black flags with the Shahada, which is the flag that most of your listeners probably are familiar with as being called the Al-Qaeda flag, or perhaps the ISIS flag. We also saw the white flag with the black Shahada, which is commonly considered a caliphate flag, and of course the presence of the green Hamas flag and Palestinian flags with the Shahada written upon them, which is typically used by Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. So these were protests that had a very distinct Islamic character. They had a very distinct anti-Semitic character, and a lot of that was just not being covered.
Kyle, we are, of course, huge fans and active supporters of the Center for Security Policy. And one of the things that's always impressed me across your organization is that there's a very clear understanding that an analysis of the means to an end and the idea of creeping Sharia, civilization, jihad, etc. But there's a sobriety among the enormous let's call them active and or retired national security folks that basically comprise the orbit around the Center for Security Policy. And almost to a man, or in some cases woman, there is a clear understanding of this sort of civilization jihad. And the question I have for you, because it really concerns me, it seems that so many, not just on the left, but on the right as well, are fooled by a polite-speaking Islamist in a well-tailored suit. And I want you to speak, if you would, a little bit from your own findings of where and how you think we'll be able to see a change in that trend to where we have a clear recognition of the fact that there's not much of a difference between Hamas and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, all of these Islamists have the same end game, and that includes the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, part of what the center has focused on, and this is really part of the reason why we stood up the Threat Information Center, is, as your listeners probably know, we authored a book here at the center called Sharia, the Threat to America. And what we were trying to do is really establish a Team B analysis that would take another look at the threat and do a real, what's called, threat doctrine analysis, which is to say, examine what the enemy says that he's about, says he intends to do and how he intends to do it, and then take him seriously. And so that has always been the guiding light of the center, and a lot of the folks surrounded in the center that work with us is to take them seriously. So we look at a man like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's 87, almost 88 years old. He is not a military man. He is not an administrator. He is not an organizer. What is he? He's a scholar of Sharia. He has many doctorates and has written many books on jurisprudence in Sharia, in Islamic law. And that is where he derives his authority, And that is what enables him to make calls which are then answered by organizations that respect his authority on the Sharia. And if you do not do a threat doctrine analysis of the enemy, if you impose upon the enemy your perspective of what you think he ought to believe, of what you think his objectives should reasonably be, you're going to make errors. And what we've seen in the war on terror has been a steady series of errors because we at no point ever did that. And part of the reason we never did that was because these connections we had with individuals with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood who wanted to make sure that wouldn't take place. And so if we do not confront the infiltration, the subversion threat, which is a legitimate national security threat, we've fought enemies before that had very serious subversion and infiltration capabilities. Of course, the Soviets spent a great deal of effort on intelligence and subversion and these sorts of things. So it's not necessarily new to us, but we become uncomfortable because it has this religious veneer, and so we don't want to talk about it.
You know, I'm so glad you just made the analysis the way you did, because it seems to me that despite all the false rhetoric from the last election cycle, that in fact we won the Cold War on the ground, but we lost it in the long run because they subverted us at the university level. And you have to look no further than the empty chair that occupies the White House to see the manifestation of that. So the question I have in there is, for all the analysis that you and Brett were doing on the anti-Semitism that became extraordinarily obvious as a manifestation of the Gaza conflict, we saw two trends that I found very alarming I'd like you to speak to. One is that the left, not just the far left, but the left seems to have an unusual sensitivity to an allowance of the word Islamophobe to literally bring self-defense to a crawl. And another very disturbing trend is the youth seem to be, in America and in Europe, seem to be very willing to look at the Islamists as victims without necessarily seeming to appreciate that the end game doesn't end well for any of us, whether we would call ourselves Republicans, Democrats, or libertarians. We all die in the end. Well,
when you look at especially the Muslim Brotherhood in North America, they are very, very skillful at speaking in sort of leftist paradigm of the traditional sort, victimization language, this sort of thing. And they have very, very skillfully adopted this sort of rhetoric, and that has enabled them to make alliances with a wide variety of, groups that are operating in this space that may be civil rights groups, although some of them, have their own agendas as well. But they're very, very successful at disarming us by utilizing a narrative which has been constructed before we engaged in our confrontation with them, by simply moving their terms and their desires through this paradigm, this leftist paradigm, which we are as a society sort of prepared to receive. So we're used to hearing claims of victimhood, and we're used to responding to calls of racism, and of course racism is terrible and rightfully so, but to be able to use that to shut off debate and to shut out dialogue rather than to promote it is very useful to them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, Kyle, in the last few minutes or moments that we have with you, we do have a ceasefire in the Gaza right now. Have you seen a minimization of the protest, the call for protest, or things that are going on, or do we continue to see the calls? And has anything changed in the information and the sources which you're monitoring right now?
Well, actually, we've seen even an uptick in violence. As you're probably aware, there was an assault of a Jewish man and woman in New York City, where the man was attacked, and then the perpetrators sped off flying a Palestinian flag. There was a student, I think it was in Philadelphia, that was punched in the face. In Turkey, which I didn't actually get a chance to mention, but Turkey is very, very close to the Muslim Brotherhood. The ruling party in Turkey is. And there were tremendous protests there. They attacked the Israeli embassy and forced the Israelis to withdraw a level of diplomatic members there. And there was a killing of a very prominent Jewish family in Turkey. So, if anything, we're still seeing, even if it's not large-scale protests, we're still seeing sort of the aftermath of this call for intifada. And even just before I got on the phone call, I noted a news story which is pointing out that the group which organized the Gaza flotilla, as it was called, you may be familiar with the ship, the Mavi Marmara, which was raided by Israeli commandos after it attempted to run the blockade, and that resulted in a very violent confrontation with the protesters there. Protesters may be the wrong word, with the jihadists there that were armed with knives and sticks and rods and other sorts of weapons. So that same group, which is called the IHH, is actually preparing to launch a second flotilla. And this is noteworthy for us because in addition to very probably being a violent confrontation if the Israelis are forced to stop it, IHH is also a member of the Union of the Good and therefore has direct ties to Youssef al-Qaradawi. So this is another example where we can see an organization and an event taking place, but far too many people are unable to see sort of the guiding hand of the Muslim Brotherhood in these sorts of activities and the guiding hand of Youssef al-Qaradawi because he's dismissed as sort of an old man that is a scholar.
Yeah, and it's really incredible. I guess we're very short on the segment now, but I could say this. I'd love to also know which members of our Congress or organizations in Washington, D.C. are also supporting and working with a lot of these organizations, because I think that's something that we could directly impact and positively affect by pointing out who they are and trying to bring awareness to try to stop that type of business, if you will. But Kyle, thank you so much for joining John and I in the Final Say today. Folks, you can find out more. You can go to the Center for SecurityPolicy.org. And Kyle, do you have a specific link or directive to find the report or the information on this?
You can find the report if you go to our website under Occasional Papers. It will be the first occasional paper, and it's Command and Control, the International Union of Muslim Scholars, the Muslim Brotherhood, and calls for a global intifada during the Operation Protective Edge. That's the name of the paper.
Excellent. Well, Kyle Shideler, thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it very much.
All right. Take care.